Oh, she gonna grab her mouth too? Oh my God, bro. Oh my God, bro. She grabbed her face and everything.
There is a moment in sports history when the noise becomes impossible to ignore. When the doubters, the critics, the cynics, and the gatekeepers all gather together in one unified chorus of negativity, screaming at the top of their lungs that a particular athlete is finished, overrated, exposed, or simply not as special as everyone believed. These moments happen regularly in professional sports. The media machine needs fuel, and tearing down rising stars is the most efficient combustible material available. But every once in a while, an athlete does not just survive that orchestrated assault. They obliterate it. They do not quietly endure the criticism and slowly rebuild their reputation over months of careful, measured performances. Instead, they walk directly into the center of the storm, on the biggest stage available, under the brightest lights imaginable, and they deliver a moment so seismic, so historically undeniable, that the very people who spent weeks constructing the narrative of their downfall are left standing in stunned, humiliated silence. That is exactly what happened with Caitlyn Clark and the Indiana Fever's Commissioner Cup matchup. And the numbers that followed did not just tell a story. They rewrote the entire history of women's professional basketball in a single evening. Before we talk about the record-shattering numbers, before we celebrate the historic milestone that dropped like a thunderbolt on every single person who doubted Caitlyn Clark's transcendent ability to move the needle, we need to be completely honest about what the media spent the weeks leading up to this game aggressively trying to accomplish. The credentialed sports media, the established voices, the veterans who have covered the WNBA for decades, and the coaching staff inside the Indiana Fever's own facility collectively decided that Caitlyn Clark needed to be reeled in. They needed to push a specific narrative. They needed the casual sports fan to believe that the unprecedented explosion of interest surrounding the 22-year-old Iowa product was beginning to naturally cool down. They needed people to believe that the hype was simply hype, that the bubble was deflating, and that women's basketball would eventually return to its comfortable, established baseline of viewership and cultural relevance. And to be completely fair to the people pushing that narrative, they had some ammunition available. Clark's start to the professional season had been statistically slower than the extraordinary standard she set during her historic college career. The Indiana Fever's offensive system, installed and stubbornly maintained by head coach Stephanie White, was generating legitimate criticism from basketball analysts who understood that forcing one of the most gifted playmakers and shooters of her generation into a stagnant, isolation-heavy half-court offense was an almost criminally wasteful decision. The visible frustration between Clark and her coaching staff was becoming impossible to ignore. Sideline moments were being filmed, dissected, and amplified across every social media platform imaginable. The media had their angle. They sharpened their pens and they ran with it. Column after column declared that Clark's attitude was becoming a distraction. Broadcast segments questioned whether the friction between the rookie star and her veteran coaching staff was poisoning the locker room culture. Former players and analysts who had spent their entire careers operating within the comfortable confines of a lower-profile WNBA suggested that Clark needed to humble herself, fall in line, and trust the process being installed by a coaching staff with significantly more professional experience. They said the casual fans were tuning out. They said the novelty had worn off. They said the frustratingly slow offensive pace and the visible sideline drama were driving people away from their televisions. They were not just wrong. They were catastrophically, historically, record-shatteringly wrong 1079 million viewers. Let that number breathe for a moment. Let it fully settle into your understanding of what professional women's basketball has looked like historically, what the realistic ceiling for WNBA viewership has been for the majority of the league's existence, and what the critics were actively predicting just days before tip-off. 10.79 million viewers tuned in to watch the Indiana Fever's Commissioner Cup game. Nearly 11 million people made a conscious, deliberate decision to sit down in front of their televisions and watch a WNBA game on a night when they had countless other entertainment options available to them. That is not a bump in ratings. That is not a successful performance during a favorable broadcast window. That is an absolute, tectonic, paradigm-shifting cultural moment that has permanently altered the conversation around women's professional basketball. For context, that number is not just the highest-rated WNBA game of the current season. It is not just the most watched Commissioner Cup game in the history of that particular competition. It is the single most watched WNBA game ever recorded in the history of the entire league. No game, no finals matchup, no marquee regular season showdown has ever drawn this level of viewership. The record did not just fall. It was demolished. It was vaporized. It was replaced by a number so far beyond previous benchmarks that the conversation has to start completely from scratch. Those numbers compete with NBA playoff broadcasts. They rival major network primetime programming. They demand the same respect and the same analytical attention that networks and leagues give to the most valuable sports properties in the entire American media landscape. And every single media member, every single veteran analyst, every single credentialed journalist who spent the previous weeks writing obituaries for the Caitlyn Clark phenomenon owes the sports-watching public a complete and thorough accounting of how spectacularly wrong their analysis turned out to be. But here is where the celebration becomes complicated. Here is where the record-breaking viewership number transforms from a simple victory lap into something far more complex and, frankly, far more troubling. Nearly 11 million people tuned in to watch Caitlyn Clark play basketball. That is an extraordinary demonstration of her singular ability to generate mainstream cultural interest in a sport that has historically struggled to break through the noise of a crowded American sports landscape. Those viewers tuned in expecting to see the player they fell in love with during her historic college career. They tuned in expecting to see the fearless, high-volume, deep-range shooting. They expected the dazzling court vision passing that made her a viral phenomenon. They expected the relentless transition offense, the pick-and-roll mastery, the complete, beautiful, flowing offensive package that turned a college basketball player into a legitimate crossover sports celebrity. Instead, according to widespread reports and the observations of countless fans and analysts who watched the broadcast, they were largely subjected to Stephanie White's stagnant, increasingly criticized offensive system. The same half-court isolation concepts that have been generating negative commentary all season long were on full display on the single biggest stage in WNBA history. The high-energy, dynamic basketball that Clark's fanbase desperately wanted to see was replaced by the same sluggish, disjointed offensive execution that has been the subject of internal and external frustration throughout the season. The viewers showed up in record numbers. The product on the floor, through no fault of Caitlyn Clark's individual effort, failed to fully reward their investment. And that, more than any other element of this entire situation, represents the most pressing and urgent problem inside the Indiana Fever organization. Adding another deeply complicated layer to an already difficult situation were the circulating reports that Caitlyn Clark was not at full physical health heading into this historic broadcast. According to multiple reports, Clark was dealing with a significant illness in the days leading up to tip-off. She was battling physical ailments that would have given any reasonable observer complete justification for a reduced performance level, and by some accounts, might have even justified sitting out entirely. She did not sit out. She suited up, laced her sneakers, walked out onto that court, and carried the weight of a record-breaking broadcast on her 22-year-old shoulders while her body was fighting against her. Think about what that represents for a moment. Think about the mental and competitive fortitude required to perform on a stage of this magnitude, with the entire narrative of women's basketball's commercial viability riding on your performance, while simultaneously managing a physical condition that was clearly affecting your stamina and rhythm. Her slow start was not evidence of a player who has been exposed by the professional game. Her slow start was the visible result of a sick young woman doing everything physically possible to compete at the highest level available to her. She gave everything she had. And what did she receive in return from the opposing defenses she faced? The same physical targeting that has been a persistent and troubling storyline throughout her professional career. Hard contact, physical challenges at every opportunity. A style of defensive aggression that tests the limits of what the officiating in the WNBA is willing to permit against its most visible, most commercially valuable player. The image of Clark grabbing her face, absorbing punishment while the crowd reacts with visible alarm, is not an image of a player who cannot handle the physical demands of the professional game. It is an image of a competitor refusing to surrender despite being placed in an impossible situation by multiple parties simultaneously. This brings us to the most uncomfortable and arguably most important conversation in the entire Caitlyn Clark narrative, which is the growing, increasingly undeniable question of whether Stephanie White's coaching philosophy and Amber Cox's roster management decisions are actively limiting what should be the most offensively explosive player in the league. The criticism of Stephanie White's offensive system is not new, and it is not simply the loud complaints of an impatient fan base that does not understand the complexities of professional basketball. It is a substantive, analytically grounded argument that the half-court isolation concepts being deployed do not leverage Clark's specific strengths. Her elite pick-and-roll instincts are being underutilized. The off-ball screening actions that would consistently create open catch and shoot opportunities for her devastating long-range shooting are largely absent from the Fever's offensive game planning. The transition opportunities that made Clark so electric in college are being sacrificed in favor of a slower, more controlled pace that theoretically reduces defensive exposure, but practically neutralizes her most dangerous offensive weapons. What makes this particularly difficult to process is the context provided by those record-breaking viewership numbers. When nearly 11 million people tune in to watch a single WNBA regular season game, the conversation about offensive philosophy stops being purely an internal basketball debate. It becomes a business conversation. It becomes a question of organizational responsibility to the audience that a particular player has attracted. Those 11 million viewers are not a neutral audience that will passively accept any product placed in front of them indefinitely. They are fans who have developed a specific emotional investment in watching Caitlyn Clark operate within an offensive system that showcases her abilities. They will return as long as the product rewards their viewership. But audiences are not infinitely patient, and the gap between what Clark is capable of producing within a properly designed offensive system and what she is currently being asked to execute represents a risk that the Indiana Fever front office needs to take seriously. The physical targeting Clark absorbed during this game, on the sport's biggest stage, raises another equally pressing question about organizational protection. Where was the structural offensive response to the aggressive defensive attention Clark was receiving? When a star player is being physically challenged and face guarded with that level of intensity, the coaching staff's responsibility is to design actions that punish the defense for their aggression. Screens that create contact fouls, pick-and-roll actions that force switching and create mismatches, off-ball movement that demands the defense make impossible choices. Those responses were not visible in sufficient quantity. And the opposing defenses have clearly learned that physical aggression against Clark will not be consistently countered by the Fever's offensive scheme. Here is the reality that the Indiana Fever front office, coaching staff, and every single media member who spent the past weeks trying to diminish Caitlyn Clark's cultural impact needs to fully internalize. You cannot manage a player who delivers 11 million viewers the same way you manage a role player on a mid-tier roster. The financial, cultural, and institutional responsibilities that come with housing the most watched attraction in the history of your sport are fundamentally different from the standard coach-player dynamic. This is not an argument for special treatment in the sense of exemption from accountability or professional standards. This is an argument for basic organizational intelligence. When your player is delivering unprecedented viewership numbers that surpass anything the league has ever seen, the coaching staff's primary responsibility shifts. It is no longer sufficient to simply implement your preferred system and demand that your players adapt to your vision. You must find the intersection between your coaching philosophy and your star players' generational abilities, and you must do it quickly, because the audience is watching and the audience has options. The established media and the coaching staff both made the same fundamental miscalculation. They assumed that the Caitlyn Clark phenomenon was a temporary spike, an anomaly driven by March Madness momentum and college basketball nostalgia that would inevitably fade as the professional season wore on. They assumed they had time. They assumed the pressure was manageable and temporary. The 10.79 million viewers proved that assumption catastrophically wrong. The pressure is not temporary. The audience is not fading. The responsibility to properly deploy and protect the player who is generating this level of interest is not a recommendation or a suggestion. It is an organizational imperative that the Indiana Fever can no longer afford to take lightly. Let us take a moment to be completely clear about what this viewership record means for every media voice that spent the past several weeks constructing the narrative of Caitlyn Clark's declining cultural relevance. The argument that casual fans were tuning out has been empirically destroyed by a number that represents the single largest WNBA audience in history. The argument that the sideline drama and visible coaching friction was driving viewers away has been obliterated by a broadcast that attracted more viewers than any previous WNBA game, regardless of context, stakes, or broadcast positioning. The argument that her slow start to the professional season was definitive evidence of overratedness has been completely undermined by the reality that even a physically ill, offensively constrained Caitlyn Clark generates more television interest than the WNBA has ever produced. These are not minor corrections to slightly inaccurate analysis. These are complete, total, comprehensive failures of sports media judgment from voices who are actively working to reshape public perception of the most exciting player in women's basketball. The hype is not dead. The casual fans have not moved on. The Caitlyn Clark effect is not a temporary phenomenon driven by novelty. It is a genuine, deep, sustainable shift in the cultural footprint of women's professional basketball, and it has been demonstrated on the largest possible stage with the most unambiguous possible evidence. The record has been shattered. The critics have been humiliated in the most complete and public fashion imaginable. Caitlyn Clark survived the orchestrated campaign to diminish her impact and responded by generating the single most watched game in the history of the league she just joined. But surviving is not the same as thriving. And while this viewership milestone represents an extraordinary vindication for Clark and everyone who believed in her ability to transform women's basketball, it simultaneously amplifies the urgency of the legitimate problems that still exist inside the Indiana Fever organization. Nearly 11 million people are now watching with extraordinary interest and equally extraordinary expectations. They have seen the record broken. They have witnessed proof that Caitlyn Clark can deliver audiences that compete with major professional sports broadcasts. But audiences reward results, and the most important result they are waiting for is not a viewership record. It is an offensive system worthy of the player producing those records. It is a coaching staff willing to adapt their philosophy to protect and properly deploy a once-in-a-generation talent. It is an organization prepared to match the ambition and the competitive hunger of the player who is quite literally carrying their franchise on her back while battling illness, physical targeting, and institutional resistance simultaneously. The Indiana Fever front office is officially on notice. The comfortable darkness of modest ratings and manageable expectations is permanently gone. 11 million eyes are watching. 11 million people showed up expecting something extraordinary, and delivering anything less than the best possible version of Caitlyn Clark in the best possible offensive environment is no longer an acceptable outcome. The critics have been silenced for now. But silence is temporary, and the questions about organizational competence and strategic vision inside the Fever will grow louder with every game that fails to fully unleash what those 11 million viewers came to watch. Caitlyn Clark has done her part. She has delivered the audience. She has delivered the cultural moment. She has delivered the historic record on a night when her body was telling her to rest. Now the Indiana Fever organization must decide whether they are genuinely worthy of the extraordinary gift they have been handed. Because with 11 million people watching, there is absolutely nowhere left to hide. Drop comment below. Did Stephanie White waste the biggest audience in WNBA history with her offensive game plan? Subscribe for daily Caitlyn Clark and WNBA coverage. Like this video if you think the Indiana Fever need to fix their offensive system immediately.